In this lesson, you'll learn concepts behind content providers and see a sample application that uses a content provider, Notepad, in action. This is one of a series of lessons on content providers. In the Eclipse Package Explorer, we see the app source and resources and manifest file. I've opened the Notepad app in Eclipse and set it to run on Android 4.2. You can open Notepad in the Working Files sample workspace or create it from the Android sample apps using a wizard as we saw in the lesson on using Android wizards. So let's see how the app works. The display you see here is the one presented when the app is started. It lists the notes already stored in the app database. I've added a starter item, Milk. As we'll see in detail as we explore the individual modules of the app, a content provider component called Notepad Provider here in the Java files is working in the background to retrieve data, the app item Milk in this case, from a database and deliver it to the user interface component for display. If we click the Add Note icon here, the user interface pulls up a new screen for entering a new note. Since we want milk, of course, we also want cookies. So we'll type in cookies, COOKIES. We remove the keyboard and click Save. The item is passed through to the content provider, which adds it to the database, and the user interface adds it to the list displayed here. So that's the basics of what's going on in the app. Now we'll look in a little more detail at what's taking place within the app. But before we do, a general comment about the material in the content provider lessons. There are some intricate relationships between the various pieces of a content provider implementation, and I've worked to make this, as well as all the other lessons, as easy to understand as possible. However, at times, a graphic might contain more information than you can absorb in the time it takes me to talk through it. And when that happens, I suggest you pause the playback and give yourself enough time to study the graphic and let the concepts really sink in. So now on to the details. This graphic shows how app functions relate to the screens we saw in our demo of the app. Let's first look at the layout of the modules in the app. I've divided the modules into two groups. The content user group running in its thread, and the content manager group, which is running in its own optional thread. Because accessing data can take some time to complete, it's a good idea to run the content manager operations in a separate thread, like we saw in the lesson on threads and async tasks. The Notepad sample app doesn't use a separate thread in order to keep the app as simple as possible, but it's a good practice in a real-world app to use a separate background thread for content management. Within these two groups, there are some subgroups. The first are the functions in light blue, and these focus on the user interface, including our screen displays. We've already had some lessons touching on the user interface, so you should be able to understand the basics of what the app is doing to display our data. In future lessons, we'll go into more detail about the user interface. In this group above are the database management functions. These perform the actual database operations to manage the data on the physical database. In our case, the functions are SQLite functions. And there are separate lessons in this course on database functions, so we won't focus on those in this series on content providers. Finally, the group outlined in orange is the group we'll be focusing on. This is where the action takes place with the content provider. It's subdivided into three subpieces: the content interface, data subset, and the content provider itself. The content interface is code that takes information from the user interface and assembles it for use by the content provider. To do this, it uses objects shown in the data subset block: content resolver, URI, cursor, and content values. This information is then passed to the content provider. The content provider is responsible for the code that invokes database functions, using, in this case, our SQLite functions. After the database function is performed, the content provider passes the information through to the data subset, which then goes on to the content interface, then to the user interface, and finally on to the screens you see. I know what you're thinking. Why so many handoffs? Well, here's the explanation. First, remember this is a lesson on content providers. The very nature of a content provider adds one of the levels of separation. A content provider can provide data across apps. This means that there must be a separation between the content interface and the content provider. The content user and content manager may not be in the same app. For example, the content provider that accesses the people's contact on your device can be used by multiple other apps. Content providers are a powerful example of code reuse. Within an app, if you didn't feel you needed a content provider, the content interface could work directly with database management. One reason for this separation is so that you can implement a background thread to prevent long-running operations from interfering with the user interface. Another reason is that the SQLite database functions are implemented in their own set of classes and objects. Now let's look at more about content providers and when you might want to use them. Content providers are one of the 4 basic Android component types. As explained on the Android website, content providers present data to external applications as one or more tables that are similar to the tables found in relational databases. So if we look down at their little sample, each row represents an instance of some type of data. In this example, a dictionary word. Columns represent information about that entry, such as frequency. And we'll learn much more about this method of organization in coming lessons. Google suggests 3 main reasons for using a content provider. The first is to share data with other apps, such as the people contacts I mentioned. The second is to provide custom search suggestions. And you've probably seen this kind of thing when you're typing in a search and you get a list of potential search terms as you type. There's a link below here to more information on custom search on the Android website. And the third reason is when you want to cut and paste complex data for files from your app to other apps. There's also a link below for more information on copy and paste on the Android website. In this course, we won't be addressing custom search or copy and paste functions. The explanations on the website are fairly extensive if you need to implement these functions. So that's an overview of content provider concepts and a first look at a content provider app. And we'll dig into much more detail on content providers in the next few lessons.